Hello, world literature. So right now I'm going to record the first 3 chapters, what we did on Wednesday, April 11th. But first I'm going to show you how to get to that part of the class. So if you click on The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr Hyde, and scroll to Wednesday, April 11th, I have the study guide questions here in a document. I've also figured out how to do a PDF of chapters 1 through 3, and I've scanned those in. I've also done this for 4 through 7, which we're doing today, Thursday, April 12th, along with the study guide there as well. So here is chapters 1 through 3 of Dr. Jekyll and Mr Hyde. We'll zoom in a little bit. Alright, I think that should be good. Yep. Alright, Chapter 1, The Door. It was often said that Mr. Utterson was very quiet for a lawyer. He was happier listening to others talk than talking himself. He did not brag or boast about his work. He did not spend too much time thinking about himself. Quite simply, he was a rare and admired man. His clients were the misfits of society. They were people who often lived and worked on the wrong side of the law. Mr. Utterson always minded his own business and kept his distance. He merely did his job, and he prepared wills and arranged finances, and turned a blind eye to everything else. He was careful never to get involved. Mr. Utterson was a man of order and routine. He never seemed to do anything even remotely exciting. In fact, he felt quite uneasy if anything was out of place. His schedule was set, and he did not like the idea of change. He loved theater, but he had not gone in over 20 years. He loved bridge, but he never played. The truth was that many people considered Mr. Utterson to be dreary, dusty, and old and cold. Yet Mr. Utterson was a well-loved man. His friends saw a different side to him. They saw a special spark in his eye. They knew him to be a kind, concerned, and caring man. He was a favorite guest at dinner parties. He could always be counted on to listen to problems and offer wise advice. He was considered a dear, trusted friend by any who knew him. Mr. Utterson's friends were relatives or men that he had known for many, many years. He did not look outside his small circle for new friends. This suited his need for order and structure. So each and every Sunday, Mr. Utterson joined his cousin, Mr. Enfield, for a walk. They had been meeting for their Sunday walks for many years. So many years, in fact, they had lost count. They must have looked a strange pair to all who passed them. The two men spoke very little while walking side by side. They walked in silence, hands in pockets, each swinging walking sticks by their sides. When they happened to see a friend along the way, they seemed overjoyed for the distraction. They always urged a friend to join them on their journey. Looks can be deceiving, however. The men enjoyed their Sunday walks a great deal and refused to let anything delay them. It was on one of their walks that Mr. Utterson and Mr. Enfield found themselves at a busy section of London. People filled the streets. Everyone, it seemed, was enjoying the sunny day. Mr. Utterson and his cousin turned down a quiet side street. Normally the street was full of people, but the shops were closed on Sunday. Therefore the two men had the street almost to themselves. Unlike the rest of the neighborhood, which was run down, the residents and the buildings along the street were doing well. The buildings were neat and clean, with freshly painted shutters and well-polished brass details. Mr. Utterson and Mr. Enfield admired the houses and shops they walked past. 2 doors from the end of the block stood a building different from the rest. It had a battered doorway leading to a courtyard. The paint on the door was chipped, and the latch looked about to fall off. The building was 2 stories high. From what they could see from the street, it looked like it was in complete disrepair. The building looked neglected and abandoned. There were no windows on the wall facing the 2 men, only the door, without a bell or knocker. They were standing across the street from the building. Mr. Enfield lifted his cane and pointed. "Have you ever noticed that door?" he asked his cousin. Mr. Utterson answered that he had. "It always makes me remember a very odd story," Mr. Enfield continued. "Really?" said Mr. Utterson. "And what was that?" He looked at his cousin. Mr. Enfield was deep in thought. Chapter 2. Enfield's Story. After some time, Mr. Enfield replied, "Well, it was this way. I was walking home very late one night. The path I took was completely empty. I saw no one for many blocks. The fog had set in, so there was no moonlight. Only the street lights to keep me company. I'll admit that I felt a bit scared. It's odd to be the only human in a dark and lonely area. At least, I thought I was the only person out that night. Quite suddenly, I saw two other figures on the street. One was a man walking away from me, and the other was rather short and stooped over. I was surprised by his speed. He moved very quickly and with clear purpose. The other was a little girl about 8 or 9 years old. She was running along the cross street. Naturally, the two ran into each other as the girl turned around the corner. The man knocked the girl down. It was horrible. He did not stop. He stepped on her leg and continued on his way. He barely seemed to notice her. The poor girl lay crying on the street, and the man did not stop or even look her way. I realize that my description doesn't sound like much, but it was a horrible thing to see. His actions were so cold. I yelled at the man and ran after him. I caught up with him quite easily and grabbed his arm. He did not resist as I brought him back to the screaming child. Actually, he looked perfectly calm. He wasn't the least bit bothered by his actions. Just then, the man gave me a look so ugly that I began to sweat. It was as though I had just finished exercising. The girl's family rushed outside. She had been returning from going to get the doctor when this man knocked her over. Thankfully, the doctor wasn't far behind her in the street. He attended to the screaming child at once. He said she was more frightened than hurt. In any other circumstances, that might have been the end of it, but I had taken such a disliking to this strange fellow that I couldn't let it go. I wasn't alone in this feeling either. The girl's family was similarly horrified, of course. But it was the doctor's reaction that struck me the most. Whenever he looked at the man, the doctor grew sick, white with anger and hatred. At first I thought he recognized the strange man, but I don't think that was the case. There was something about the man that caused so strong a reaction. Looking into the villain's face made you feel so uncomfortable that you wanted to turn away instantly. His eyes were lifeless and cold. His mouth was twisted into a cruel smile. I can only describe what I felt as horror. It was quite unusual. "What did you do?" Mr. Utterson asked. "Did you call the police?" Mr. Utterson was gripped by this story. He needed to hear the ending. How was the strange man connected with the battered door across the street from them? "We tried a different tactic," Mr. Enfield continued. "We told this man we would spread the story of his cruel deed throughout London. Everyone would be talking about it. We warned him that if he had any friends or business, he would soon lose them. I expect this man to be sorry, but he seemed little affected by our comments. If you choose to make such a fuss about this accident," he said to me coldly, "then I have no choice but to obey your demands. After all, no gentleman wants to make a scene." His voice was so calm that it gave me shivers. And then this awful man actually smiled. It was an awful, sinister smile. "Name your price," he said. With very little argument, the strange man agreed to pay the girl's family £100. The doctor and I agreed to stay with the man to get the money. We followed him to the door, this very door that stands across from you and me right now, where he disappeared for a few minutes. He came back outside with a check for £100. I examined it. I was shocked by the name on the check. It was the name of a well-known and upstanding citizen. Clearly this strange man had forged a signature or obtained it by unlawful means. "Set your mind at rest," the man sneered. "I will stay with you until morning and cash the check myself. You will see it is good." So the doctor, the strange man, and I returned to my house, where we waited until the banks opened. It was a very uncomfortable wait. None of us spoke. The doctor and I watched this man with great curiosity. He stared into the fireplace the whole time. Finally, morning arrived, and we set off for the bank. I told the teller that I had every reason to believe this check was fake. I was so shocked to learn that it was real. "Tut, tut," Mr. Utterson replied, and shook his head. "I can see you feel the same as I do," Mr. Enfield said. "Yes, and it's a sad story. The strange man that I met was truly an awful fellow, someone that you would never want to meet. He was frightening and evil." Mr. Enfield shook his head sadly. "And the man whose name that was on the check was a man of merit and good standing in society. I cannot imagine what brought the two of them together. Since that night I've referred to this building as the Blackmail House. I can only assume that the strange and wicked man holds some secret over this gentleman." Mr. Enfield drifted into his own thoughts. "And you know," Mr. Utterson said, "if the gentleman who wrote the check actually lives in this building?" "I believe he lives somewhere in the Soho district," Mr. Enfield said, absent-mindedly. "I've watched the door from time to time," he continued. "It barely seems like a house at all. There are no windows on the inside. No one comes in or goes out. Occasionally that man. I've caught a few glimpses through the door and noticed that there are 3 windows facing the inner courtyard that are kept clean, and there is often smoke from the chimneys, so someone must live there." As the two men continued on their walk, Mr. Utterson was deep in thought. "Enfield," he said, "would you mind telling me the name of the man who knocked the child down?" "Well," said Enfield, "I can't see what harm it would do. It was a man by the name of Hyde. Edward Hyde." Utterson took a deep breath. He recognized the name. "Ah, I see," he said. "Could you describe him to me?" "As I said, he's not easy to describe," Enfield replied. "There was something unusual about him, something disturbing. I want to say horrible. I reacted with such strong dislike at the sight of him, yet I don't know why. His clothes were baggy and too big for him. He wore a tall hat and a cape. He had a slight hunch. No, on second, I don't think I can describe him. It's not that I forget what he looks like. I simply don't have the words." "Are you certain that he used a key to get in the building?" Utterson asked. "Of course," Enfield said. "I know my questions must seem strange," said Utterson. "The fact is I don't need to ask the name of the other party. I already know it. You see, Enfield, the name Hyde is quite familiar to me. I cannot offer any details, but I can tell you he is linked to a document I am preparing for a dear friend of mine, Dr. Henry Jekyll. If you told any lie or exaggeration during this story, please tell me. I must know all the facts." "Every word I have said is true," said Enfield. He was slightly hurt that his cousin doubted him. He was not used to people, especially his cousin, questioning him. "Hyde had a key to the building, and what's more, he still has it. I saw him use it not a week ago." Mr. Utterson sighed deeply, but not a word. He was thinking about that battered doorway and the courtyard beyond it. He already had concerns about this man Hyde. He now knew that he could not ignore this mystery any longer. Unfortunately, he had no idea what he should do next. "Utterson," Enfield said, "I'm sorry that I mentioned Hyde or this story. Let us promise never to discuss it again." He put his hand on his cousin's shoulder. It was clear that Utterson was very upset by the news. Enfield wanted to hear Utterson's story about Hyde, but he knew how much his cousin respected other people's privacy. Utterson would never reveal someone else's secret. "With all my heart," the lawyer said. He was relieved that Enfield asked no more questions. "Let's shake hands on the matter and leave it be." The two cousins shook hands and continued on their walk. They spent the rest of their time together in silence. Chapter 3. A Conversation with Dr. Lanyon. It was Mr. Utterson's custom on Sunday nights to enjoy a good book by the fire and be in bed by midnight. On this night, however, Utterson sat down to dinner in bad spirits. He had too much on his mind, and had a touch of indigestion. As soon as his plate was taken away, he went to his den. He opened his safe and removed some private papers.